Thanks a lot, Line. And in my talk, I will mention a little bit aspects related to the regulation of medical countermeasures. And my presentation is diligently following the title that I was assigned to, which is the regulatory framework of licensure of medical countermeasures during public health emergencies. And with medical countermeasures, I mean medicinal product for prevention or treatment of disease caused by transmissible agents. I will not talk about diagnostics, and this gives me a great opportunity to clarify that the EMA is not regulating diagnostics in Europe, so it's a nice way to pull me out from the label regulatory mess this morning, even if we do appreciate the relevance from a public health perspective and the need to do more in order to have more consistent approaches toward regulation of diagnostics. So, in essence, these are the topics that I will go through very rapidly, and I will start focusing essentially with the use in the European Union, starting from compassionate use, then talking about conditional market authorization and market authorization under exceptional circumstances, which probably are the most important topics for the sake of the discussion today. I would like to mention very briefly the pediatric investigation plans, and also I will take the opportunity to mention some of the specific provisions that have been put in place in the European Union for the sake of managing a pandemic influenza. But it's quite important because despite they do not really apply to a number of situations that may be envisaged in the context of this discussion, a lot can be learned from there and a lot can be used and translated into situations of emergency in the European Union and globally. Also going to the global setting, I will also mention briefly the Article 58 as an option to support WHO and the world in terms of regulating medicinal products where needed. And lastly, I will talk about other options such as some referral procedures that could be helpful for the sake of providing scientific opinion in the context of an emergency. So compassionate use, first of all, compassionate use in the European Union is completely under the responsibility of the member states, so it's not handled at all by the EMA. However, the European regulation, and in particular Article 83, mentioned that member states could ask the CHMP, which is the main scientific committee of the EMA, when compassionate use for groups of patients is envisaged, to adopt scientific opinion on the conditions of use, condition for distribution, and the patients targeted for the medicinal products in the use. So it's kind of a very draft limited product information around how to use the product, and also the kind of information that should be collected along this compassionate use. And also the regulation further states that when a member state makes use of the possibility for compassionate use for groups of patients, it shall notify the agency. So in other words, they should tell us whenever this is emerging at the national level, so that there is a chance to discuss at the pan-European level what has been proposed. Now, since the introduction of the regulation in 2005, the CHMP adopted only 5 scientific opinions for compassionate use, and essentially for 2 conditions, which are hepatitis C and influenza, which was rather disappointing, particularly if you think about other areas like oncology, where we're expecting to see a lot happening. But at the same time, points out that indeed the area of transmissible disease seems to be a quite sensitive area and an area of interest to consider this option of compassionate use. And in particular, and here is just the list of the 5 opinions that came out from the CHMP, I will focus essentially on the last 2, because zanamivir and oseltamivir phosphate refers to the IV formulation that were coming to the EMA in the middle of the pandemic, 2009-2010, so really in the context of an emergency situation. And this points to the fact that indeed this compassionate use opinion could be a tool to be used in the context of an emergency. During the Ebola crisis, were never used, but we came very close to consider them. So it's important not to forget that this is also a pathway that would allow the European system, regulatory system as a whole, to help member states in thinking about how to use medicinal products in a compassionate use. Now, going into the real market authorization tools that we have in the European legislation, most important one, I would say, is the conditional marketing authorization. This is a provisional marketing authorization on the basis of less comprehensive data and subject to specific obligation. Into scope of the conditional marketing authorization are medicine for treatment of seriously debilitating diseases or life-threatening diseases. Importantly, there is an explicit mention of the use in an emergency situation, and also for orphan medicinal products. All the criteria should be ticked whenever there is the possibility of granting a conditional marketing authorization, in terms of that the risk-benefit balance has to be positive. It is likely that the applicant will be in a position to provide comprehensive clinical data in the post-authorization phase, that an unmet medical need will be fulfilled by such authorization, and importantly also the last bullet that says that the benefit to public health or the immediate availability on the market of the medicinal product concerned outweighs the risk inherent in the fact that additional data is still required. Now, conditional market authorization is essentially saying that the less comprehensive data set refers essentially to clinical data. So it's the clinical development phase that really matters into CMA. But interestingly enough, the only exception is indeed emergency situation. That is the only situation in which it might be possible to provide later on some information on quality and on clinical. Quite recently, we issued a new guidance document around how should be interpreted conditional market authorization and how should be used. And this is a table that is provided in there. And for me, what is important to stress that among the example that has brought up as possibility for having a conditional first on certain evidence from the clinical side, and that what would be the data generated afterwards in order to convert this to a full MA, there is the clear and explicit reference to the case of vaccines, in which immunogenicity data can be provided at the time of the initial provisional market authorization, and then vaccine effectiveness data will be generated in the post-approval phase in order to convert the early approval into a full market authorization. Then the second important tool is called market authorization under exceptional circumstances, and this is that market authorization may be granted subject to certain conditions, in particular related to the safety of the medicinal product, and the market authorization may be granted only when the applicant can show that he is unable to provide comprehensive data on the efficacy and safety of the medicinal product under normal conditions of use. And this will go through annual reassessment procedures. So in other words, it is acknowledged that because of the rarity of the disease, because of other factors, it will be impossible to generate a comprehensive clinical data package. And the criteria for a market authorization under exceptional circumstances are outlined in the directive, which is when the indication for which the product in question is intended are encountered so rarely that the applicant cannot reasonably be expected to provide comprehensive evidence, or where in the present state of scientific knowledge comprehensive information cannot be provided, or it would be contrary to general accepted principle of medical ethics to collect such information. So that is really spelled out in the legislation. Now, to summarize these two potential regulatory pathways and their differences, so conditional MA would expect that comprehensive data will come after the initial authorization, and the idea is to later switch to full market authorization, while market authorization under exceptional circumstances acknowledge that comprehensive data cannot be gathered and would remain indefinitely as such. So there will be no possibility to convert this into a full market authorization, even if in the past was a bit different, but now with Santé, this has been defined as the legal term. So in a way, from now on, it looks like it will be impossible legally to convert a market authorization under exceptional circumstances into a full market authorization, which is something that has to be taken into account because can be rather problematic at times. The conditional MA is valid for 1 year only with annual renewals, while the market authorization under exceptional circumstances has normal validity as any other full MA with an annual reassessment process. The conditional MA applies only to centralized procedures, so to medicine that are applied to the EMA, while the MA under exceptional circumstances can also go through national procedures at the European level. You know Article 58, you heard a lot about that. In essence, this is also embedded in the legislation, and this is allowed the agency to give a scientific opinion in the context of cooperation with WHO for the evaluation of certain medicinal products for human use intended exclusively for markets outside the community. The process is exactly the same as for a European market authorization, so the same process of rapporteur's appointment, the same level of scrutiny of the data, and also important maybe to stress, as said, that Article 58 the scientific opinion can also go conditional or exceptional. The same rules for regulatory life cycle that applies to market authorization in Europe will apply here. So in terms of RMP, pharmacovigilance, PSUR, and all the post-authorization activities that might be envisaged. So nothing is changing from a normal authorization in the EU, with the exception that that the opinion from the EMA is not sent to the Commission for ratifying the European authorization, but it will be sent for WHO in order to help WHO and the countries that may need these products in order to make decisions in their own jurisdiction. Just to give you 3 examples of cases, particularly in the area of vaccines, which of course is probably the main area of discussion in this context, and they are very nice examples because they are very recent. So one is the conditional marketing authorization, and recently we have been approving an H5N1 live attenuated influenza vaccine via this route to be used only in a declared pandemic. Approval under exceptional circumstances, we have licensed not too long ago a vaccine for smallpox, and this was done under exceptional circumstances, recognizing the difficulty and almost the impossibility, hopefully the impossibility of generating data in terms of efficacy. And Article 58, we never had a conditional or exceptional under Article 58, but we had a recent example, which was the malaria vaccine from GSK. Few words on the pediatric legislation. Why I want to bring this up is because there is an obligation to discuss with the pediatric committee the pediatric investigation plan before a market authorization is submitted. So in other words, no manufacturer or sponsor can apply for a market authorization before there is an agreed PIP in place. So it's very important that this aspect is taken into account whenever we talk about approving medicine in the context of an emergency, because of course there is a need there to speed up things and to try to come up very rapidly with an agreement. But that's why it's also so important that the sponsor engage with the pediatric committee as early as possible, because otherwise the risk is that there will be undue delays to the market authorization process. And maybe to stress that for Article 58 procedures, this is not envisaged. So if the medicinal product is expected to go through an Article 58 procedure, there will be no need to talk with the pediatric committee. Rapid scientific advice procedures, I don't have to go through all of this, but simply to say that in the context of an emergency, as regulators, we can be rather creative and come up with ideas out of the book on how to talk to companies and sponsors in order to speed up the dialogue and to speed up the development of such products. This has been done during the pandemic. This has been done during the Ebola crisis, and also we have started doing this in the context of Zika. And there are many ways and adaptations that can be taken into account. Still, the final scientific advice will be adopted by the CHMP, so it will have a robust agreement at the end of the day. Also, it's been a great opportunity, particularly referring to Ebola, of dialogue with other regulatory authorities, in particular US FDA. We had a lot of discussion with the US FDA, particularly in those circumstances that sponsor was submitted in parallel, the same package to both agencies. And that's maybe something that we want to explore further in the future, how we can improve such system and make it even more efficient for the sake of coming with a convergent response to developers for the development of their vaccine or drugs. Rolling review, I don't have to spend too much time on this, but this is to say that when there is a crisis or an emergency, we will go through potential other routes of assessing the data. The rolling review that was adopted during the pandemic was a good example. There were 2-week cycles of review of all the data with responses incorporated into the rolling review submission. And at the end of the day, there was a wrap-up of the opinion. And then once the sponsor was notified that the EMA was ready to take an opinion, they would have then submitted the data package, which is already assessed, and then the CHMP could take a decision even within 1 day by written procedure. So that has happened and then can be done again. So there is a lot of opportunities to be flexible in terms of coming up with a regulatory decision. Scientific questions that go behind maybe a full market authorization review, even conditional, it might happen, and the referral Article 5.3 is a good way of the EMA to come up with a scientific opinion on any matter that is relevant for public health. A good example is what we have done during the Ebola crisis, where we did an assessment of all the available data for therapeutics for treatment of Ebola virus disease in order to help regulatory agencies and public health authorities across Europe and beyond Europe with respect to the availability of the data and what was the evidence around these products. Co-labeling, not much to say, but I have to admit that during the pandemic was a bit of a difficult topic, and this is an area that should not be dismissed as potentially important. I will not go through all the details here for the sake of time, but it's good not to forget that these are operational aspects that could have a huge relevance from a legal standpoint. And I think I will close here just on time. Thank you.
So we're running a bit short of time, but let's open up the floor for a few questions to Marco. And at the same time, I would like to ask the last panel members to join at the table, as I think we need to finish exactly at 4 o'clock because it starts downstairs. So questions to Marco? Yes,
so
Kenny?
The discussion around the potential of priority review vouchers for EMA, is that something that the EMA could enact, or it needs to be instructed to do so?
Well, this has been discussed long ago in the context of the orphan product, and generally was believed in Europe that was not the best way to go. Now, we are learning about the successes in the US around this approach, and it might be worth to try to understand where we are and whether it's something that we would like to reopen. But I have to admit that at that time it was pretty clear that it was not considered, for a number of reasons, the best approach to be used in order to incentivize industry to invest in neglected diseases.
Thank you. I just want to make maybe the link with the previous session on treatment and vaccine, and because we want to make sure that we cover all the pathogens and also in type of settings and so on. But then the question is also about the target population. For example, pregnant women, the vulnerable population, and the liability of where does the liability lie with the vaccine and the treatment. And I wonder if you have any comments on that.
Thank you for the difficult question. Yeah, but it's true. That is really an important aspect that has always emerged whenever there was a crisis and the potential to use medicinal products or vaccine, for which a lot of information was still missing. So clearly pregnant women, vulnerable population, it's always emerging as a big dilemma about what you can do and what you can allow doing. So it's never been easy, even during the pandemic. We put in place specific obligations, and also in the RMP, the clear need of collecting data through registry around pregnant women. But this was a question that had been continuously emerging, and even I remember when I had to go to the European Parliament to take question on the approval of pandemic influenza vaccine, that was one of the questions that I got. What about pregnant women? Is it safe for pregnant women? So there is a bit of a dilemma here, how far we can go before the actual crisis in generating data in vulnerable population that, without any specific need, when we are in peacetime, as Herman called it before, it would be extremely difficult, even from an ethical perspective, to conduct clinical trials in order to generate information in these vulnerable groups. So I don't think we got an answer, and even for kids, it's a bit of a problem, I have to admit. And with the PDCO, we've been struggling to see how to move ahead and how to think about a good strategy that would allow us to be better prepared and with better information at the time of a crisis and when these medicinal products would have to be used. But we have not found yet a good way forward, at least in general.
No, but also the link with the industry. I mean, sometimes I don't want to do the trials in the pregnant women, or don't want to because of the liability issue. So I think it could be something also to discuss in peacetime.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And also in the context of clinical trials that are running in the field, as we've seen with the Ebola, where pregnant women were excluded from many trials, and we may wonder why this has happened. So, of course, there is not an easy way out. That's all I can say.
Any other questions? Yes, a last question. Yes, please.
We've been discussing preventive measures today, and vaccine development is part of it. What I've missed today is actually discussing the development of assays to determine vaccine efficacy. Vaccine development and assay development often go hand in hand. As a matter of fact, large pharmaceutical companies do not invest into vaccine development unless there's an assay available. There's definitely a need for new assays and for assays determining your efficacy very well. What is being done by the panelists to solve this issue, and how can we get the technology that is available within the institutes, companies, etc., available to the public to make a step forward together.
Yeah, I think also this is a very good question. I limited myself to the regulatory landscape, so I'm not entering into the scientific question. I think now with the panel probably will be touching base on this. So, but yeah, it's a very important aspect that should be part of the discussion on PPPs and what can be done in the future.